So you're going to share to the cloud and I'm going to record on my computer.
Sounds good.
So we have a backup. Another couple minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So we are interviewing summer students today, and one of the fellows that we interviewed, my research assistant babysat when he was little. So now she feels old. She's all of 26.
That's funny.
Yeah, my wife's a GP and she's seeing the babies that she delivered 20 odd years ago.
Mm-hmm. Hello, everybody. We're just going to give it till 7 before we get started. What time is it there, David?
1 o'clock tomorrow for you.
Yeah.
So we're 18 hours ahead of you, which is, I still can't get my head around.
I know.
To the point where I actually loaded up to get started because I'd got it in my diary for yesterday in New Zealand. So at least I was a day ahead of myself rather than a day late. That could have been very embarrassing.
Yeah. Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to our next installment of Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Convention online. Our speaker tonight is Dr. David Manktelow. He is a plant pathologist, which is why I like him so much, and a spray application technology specialist from New Zealand. He apprenticed for 14 years in government research and extension, where he completed a PhD on refinement of tree row volume spraying for the then new intensive dwarf apple plantings. Makes you sound pretty old, bud.
Yeah,
He has been working as an independent researcher, educator, and consultant for the last 17 years. He's worked across a wide range of fruit and vegetable crops, and his focus has always been on the development and maintenance of sustainable production systems in all aspects of agrochemical use and pesticide application. For the last 3.5 years, he's been the owner-operator of Applied Research and Technologies Limited, specializing in plant protection, disease management, sustainable agrochemical use, spray application technology, and industry and extension training. I'd like to remind everybody to please stay on mute, keep your video off so that we maintain our bandwidth. I'd like to introduce Erica DeBrouwer, who is our new apple tree fruit specialist. She'll be working out of the Simcoe office. She's been working virtually since she started, but we're hoping to get her in real life at some point. The presentation is divided up into a number of segments, and what we've decided to do is stop in between the segments and address any questions that are posted in the chat. So Erica will be monitoring the chat, and if you have technical issues, she'll try and address them there. Otherwise, what we'll do is stop at regular intervals, and David will address your questions as you put them in. So please keep up with the questions in the chat, and let's make this into something besides a handsome but talking head with a nice accent. Okay, David, take it away.
I've got a nice accent. Thank you. I hope you can understand it. I don't know how many, do you do the thumbs up thing for answering questions in Zoom? Have you just muted yourself, Wendy?
Good. I just had a big coffee and I'm afraid I'm going to start burping. Yes, you can. If you go on the bottom right, you can apply, you can do thumbs up. You can, so when David asks the question, if you agree with it or whatever, if you can do some thumbs up, that would be helpful to give him some interaction in between the question periods.
I'm just keen to hear how many people, I had the privilege of coming over to Canada last year for the conference, which was wonderful, and gave a talk in the apple session and one in grapes and a couple of other things. I'm just wondering how many people that are on tonight actually attended any of those? Just
Thumbs
get a
up.
feel.
Anybody attend those? Thumbs up.
Looks like we have a few.
That's cool. Some of what I'm going to talk about today obviously touches on what we talked about last year, but it's a real opportunity for more interaction, more questions. So if I'm going over old ground, or you feel I'm off topic or whatever, just do a thumbs down, and hopefully Wendy can steer me. Wendy and Erica can steer me to where you want to go. So feel free to be as interactive as you can be, and thumbs up, thumbs down is pretty useful for that. So what I'm looking at doing, having discussed this with Wendy, was to try and break the key question here. How do you actually get effective tree fruit spraying? What can go wrong and how to get it right? Into some different subtopics, and I'll do a little talk about some of our experience in New Zealand and Australia in each of these topics, and then open it up for questions. So I've got to do a stop share and start share again to get this to work. So I'll just move into a little talk about spraying targets, and we'll see how we go from here. Just got to find the right talk. Just bear with me for a minute. I'll start with this one. Decisive here. Yeah, I'm totally indecisive. I'll get better at this as I go along. So just bear with me for a second. I've closed the file that I needed.
How about, because there isn't an option for a thumbs down, how about if we use the party face, the party thingy, the blower thing for our thumbs down when the growers are voting?
So I'll just jump in here. Like I've got multiple places where I could start from, but this is probably as good a starting point as any. Just go back to sharing the screen again. Okay, sorry about the delay in getting to this point. In registration trials, AgChem labels are based on spraying to the point of runoff. When in your labels, you always have a per hectare recommendation, Wendy?
In some cases, very few, there is a rate per 1,000 liters, but for most of them, it is per hectare.
And so when you do a trial, a registration trial in Canada, are you given a prescribed rate of chemical per hectare to put on in that trial, or range of rate? Where does that come from?
God.
Okay,
I don't know, it comes from, and it usually with an efficacy trial, there'll be a range of different rates that they'll try. So there'll be a low, medium, and high rate, because PMRA's target is the lowest effective dose.
Okay, and so when you do the maths of putting that chemical on, how do you decide what volume to apply it in?
The way that I do it is, when I did it, was I would spray the tree to drip, but not to runoff, and then multiply that up to say this is the volume per hectare, and determine by the area of the tree, I would put that much product on. So if the tree took up a thousandth of a hectare, then I would put a thousandth of the per hectare rate on the tree.
Mm-hmm. And it's exactly the same method as is used all around the world, as far as I'm aware, for tree and vine crop spray trails, ag chem trails. And the critical point in here is that the chemical labels are based on work that sprays the trees to the point of drip, but not beyond. And in Australia and New Zealand and in previous European countries, we didn't use area-based prescriptions. We actually stopped at the point of runoff. So the labels that we have in New Zealand and Australia tell the grower what concentration of chemical to put into the spray tank. So we have it as a rate per 100 litres on the label. And so all of our labels in for vine and tree fruit crops in Australia and New Zealand have a rate per 100 litres tank mix concentration, and the grower is left to work out what the runoff volume is, and they can put on whatever volume of chemical mix that they need for different size targets to reach the point of drip. And that's a really, really important concept. And what's happened in Europe with harmonization of labels and in North America is that you've gone one step further and then over-calculated to say what that is as a chemical rate per hectare, which is great if all of your canopies are identical. But if they're not, by using a constant rate per hectare, you're actually going to be potentially underdosing intensively planted or large canopies, or overdosing less intensive canopies. And the use of an anchor around an area for a crop that can be very, very different within that area is just stupid. But for the most part, it probably doesn't matter too much. It really only matters when your canopy forms change dramatically from what the product was registered on. In New Zealand in grapes, we went from a whole industry that was planted on 10-foot row spacing, 3.1 meter row spacings with fairly hairy canopies, but still vertically shoot position grapes, to an industry that's grown from about 5,000 hectares to over 40,000 hectares in the last 15 years. And we're squeezing almost twice as much canopy in per hectare as we were 20 years ago. So our average row spacing went from 3.1 meters down to something like 2.2, 2.3 meters with a bigger canopy within that space, but better managed. And it's exactly the same transition as happening in apple and stone fruit crops. We've gone from quite discrete single trees. When I started my PhD work, we were in a transition. This is back in the early 90s, and I was doing my PhD on apple spraying and the disease and pest control implications of coverage and rates and things. Our standard tree form back then was evolving from something that was planted on 5.5 to 6 meter row spacings. It had, we've gone to single leader trees predominantly, but they were highly structured with big wood in them and typically reached about 6 meters tall. And typically those were being sprayed with airblast sprayers, traveling quite slowly for the throw distance of the spray. So it was very unusual to find a sprayer that went over 5 kilometers an hour. And we would apply about 2,500 litres a hectare as a base volume to wet that canopy, dilute to the point of runoff. And we could put more on if we were putting oil sprays onto dormant trees in the winter, up to 3,000 odd litres a hectare to try and get that run in saturation coverage, even though the target was well beyond the point of runoff when it was dormant. So the transition that was happening back in the early 90s was to better clonal rootstocks away from 793 and 106 in apples towards M26, Mark and M9, which were the new dwarfing high precocity rootstocks. And what our industry was doing back then was growing the same style of tree as we used to grow in these sort of 5+ meter row spacings, 5+ meters tall, with quite a pyramidal structure. We effectively just were growing smaller versions of the same trees on these smaller rootstocks. And our standard row spacing for those was about 3.5 meters, and tree height was about 3.5 meters when it was mature. And growers were carrying on, putting on 2,000 litres a hectare onto those trees. And the work that I did suggested that you could quite safely spray those smaller trees at about half the volume that was used on the bigger standard trees. So bigger trees getting 2,000 to 2,500 litres a hectare dilute, smaller trees needing something between 800 and 1,400 litres a hectare, depending on how big and dense they were. And what's happening in New Zealand right now is that and in Australia, and I presume in Canada, is that we're doing this radical conversion to true hedgerow tree forms. Quite often very two-dimensional, so much thinner canopy walls than we used to grow. And our row spacing shrunk again from about 3.5 meters standard down to, we've got growers quite successfully growing apples, 3.5+ meter tall canopies on 2.8 meter row spacings. And they look a hell of a lot more like a grapevine now than they look like a traditional apple tree. The extreme end of that is down at 2 meters in a FOX system or UFO type system with whole series of single vertically positioned shoots. And our stone fruit growers are ahead of the apple growers in this case, with very two-dimensional tree forms which lend themselves to netting and hail, rain covers and hail netting. But for all of these, the assumptions of the spraying to the point of runoff hold. And so if you have a product and you mix it in the tank at the label mixing rate, in our case a rate per 100 litres, and you wet that target, and it doesn't matter what the target is, it's an apple canopy, it can be one of these two-dimensional forms or a great big gnarly old tree. If you wet that leaf and fruit surface to the point of runoff, so fully wet the outside and partly wet the inside, so typically when we look at the point of runoff, the inside of trees get about half the volume and chemical deposits of the outside. If you wet to the point of runoff with the dilute concentration of chemical, you would expect that chemical to work to control whatever pest or disease it's labeled for. And it's an assumption that definitely holds true. And it only fails if coverage fails or if you get resistance developing to the product. So it's like a guarantee from the chemical companies based on research that at that rate, that product's going to be efficacious. And as used in the program, as recommended on the label. So I'll jump on a little bit. I can't quite remember what's coming in these slides. If I can get this is just the part of this talk, and is looking at where the spray goes in the canopy and what's actually going on. And this is a really good example, and it just happens to be some kiwi fruit data, but I could have pulled exactly the same information for avocados, citrus, apples, stone fruit, whatever. There's a whole lot of different sprayers here. Can you see the pointer, Wendy? Hopefully you can see the pointer moving. There's 1,000 litres a hectare, 6 kilometres an hour, and whatever the fan speed was there. 600 litres a hectare, 6 Ks, 400 litres a hectare, 400 litres a hectare at 7.5 kilometres an hour with a faster fan speed. This is a kiwi fruit canopy. These are the parts of the canopy which are in closest proximity to the sprayer. We grow kiwi fruit on a pergola structure, and so the bits that are closest to the sprayer is the underside of the vines where all the fruit are, which is a happy coincidence because it makes it easier to spray the fruit. And that part of the canopy across all of those different spraying setups is getting about twice as much as if I reach an arm's length into the canopy, 2 or 3 leaves further into the canopy, and the average deposit, these are off bulk samples of leaves taken from multiple zones across the canopy. So it's a summary of a proper experiment. And you can see there that on balance, the inner parts of the canopy get about half to less than half of what the easy sprayed parts get. It's really easy for most situations to spray the outside of your target. If that's where your problems are, if that's where all the new growth is and you're trying to protect new growth, then that's great. It should be pretty easy to get control. If your problems lurk in the inner parts of the canopy, which is often the case, it's much harder to hit. But the really important thing to recognize here that is if we spray, we do the trials, we do the registration trials, we spray these canopies to the point of runoff, we expect the inside to get about half what the outside gets. And the label rates that we derive are based on the deposits that are actually experienced on the canopy. So we can live with a twofold variation in spray deposits generally and still expect to see quite high levels of efficacy, which is a really, really important concept. And the true variability in deposits is much higher than what you're seeing here. Because when you start to break it down to the individual leaf level or to an individual fruit, the variation in deposits from one side of a leaf to the other or from the side of the fruit that's facing the sprayer to the back side can be much higher than this twofold variation. And it's not at all uncommon to see 3 or 4-fold variations in the micrograms of chemical per square centimetre of surface area. And we start to see control failure in the experiments that we do when the deposit levels reach 5-fold or greater. And almost always, in my experience, that happens when you have a canopy that is overly dense. And my rule of thumb for looking for overly dense canopies is I'll go out into the orchard or vineyard around midday, and I'll look at the light shadow patterns under the trees or vines at midday in bright sun, and I expect to be able to see some sunflecks on the ground. If I see block shading under whatever the target is, then I know that I've got a canopy density problem and it's going to be difficult to spray. And it's when you get that kind of level of density that you'd expect to see 5-fold or greater variations in deposits due to the canopy, and it's almost impossible to get a sprayer to fix that. So successful spraying is a combination of canopy management and setting up the sprayer properly. And the happy coincidence is that a canopy that's able to be sprayed is usually a horticulturally good canopy in the sense that it gets light penetration, you get good development of repeat buds, you get good fruit color, you get good fruit growth. So the two, spraying and canopy management, come together. Any questions that spring to mind, Wendy, since or any questions that have come in so far?
Not so far.
Okay, well, hopefully you're all still with me.
Yep.
This whole concept of the point of runoff is incredibly subjective, I guess is the right word. It's really important to recognize that when we spray to the point of runoff or first drip, we're talking about drip on the outside, easy to spray parts of the target. And typically, as I said, we get about half as much on the inside, half to a third as much on the inside of that canopy, depending on the canopy and the sprayer. If your target pest or disease requires wetting and full runoff to achieve efficacy, which is true for a lot of mineral oils and some of the softer fungicides like the fatty acid soaps for powdery mildew eradication and things like that, you will need a higher degree of wetting. And the experience out of America and Australia, USA and Australia, in the 1970s, when they had organophosphate resistant red scale developing as a major pest problem. Now, red scale is a scaffold wood pest that lives on the inside of the tree. And for oils to be effective to smother red scale, you had to get something like, I can't remember the exact number, but it's well documented in 70s literature. I think it's something like 90+% of the inner scaffold wood wet to run off with oil. And in the Australian citrus canopies that they were growing at the time, on sort of 5 to 6 metre tall hedgerow trees on 5 to 6 metre row spacings, they were finding that they needed to apply application volumes of between 8 and 15,000 litres per hectare to wet that inner wood to the point of runoff. And in the big Florida grapefruit canopies, which could be as much as 7 metres tall, they were getting up to volumes in excess of 25,000 litres per hectare. And there was a whole spray technology that was developed around achieving that level of coverage for that pest with that pesticide. And so they used these oscillating booms. You can see one in the picture there. And there's a whole recipe with this. It was a 12-degree output angle, real jetting, lots of nozzles. And as the the nozzle went down the row, it did an oscillation pattern like this, which helped open up the canopy and get the spray in. So you can imagine what spraying like that would cost you in time and effort and chemical and all the rest of it. So this is a really good example of the fact that when we spray to the point of runoff, we don't wet the whole canopy. At the point of runoff, what we expect to see happen is about 10 to 15% of the chemical that you've just paid for and put in your tank and squirt it onto the tree will actually go straight to the ground as drip. And so spraying at the point of runoff is inefficient, and spraying beyond the point of runoff can be hellishly inefficient. The saving grace in the case of this oil example is that mineral oil forms an emulsion in water, and the oil phase of that emulsion preferentially deposits on the tree canopy. So it's soil loving, and it'll actually quite happily sit and interact with fruit and leaf waxes and things. And so you tend to get preferential deposit of the oil phase. So the stuff that's running off at these ridiculous volumes is more water than oil. And it's true for most EC formulations of pesticides and things that you'll get more deposit than you would with a wettable powder formulation. But I'm assuming that your industry is pretty much like ours, and because of fruit finish issues, we have to be very, very careful about using solvent-based, oil-based formulations, and that you're really stuck with modern versions of wettable powders, so the active ingredient suspended in the spray mix, not dissolved, and so an aqueous formulation. And if you go beyond the point of runoff, you really are chucking chemical on the ground. So yeah, the practical experience is that the best work rates, often the best droplet sizes, and often the best coverage comes when you spray below, using application volumes below the point of runoff. And the safe volume for most orchard sprayers below the point of runoff is a factor of 3 to 4 times below whatever that volume is. So if your particular canopy requires 2,000 litres a hectare, spraying that canopy with the same amount of chemical per hectare, but using a third to a quarter of the volume, so 500 to 700 litres a hectare, generally sees deposits of about 15% higher than you'd achieve if you put exactly the same amount of chemical on, but wetted that tree to the point of runoff. If you go beyond the point of runoff, all you're doing is throwing chemical on the ground. And if there's anybody ever evangelizes ultra dilute spraying in Canada, you can just support them. So, you know, here's some numbers for you. How do deposits vary with canopy size and with canopy development over a season? And so the number that I anchor around, because it's a good one to compare different canopies and sprayers and data sets against. If I put a kilo of active ingredient on per hectare, I'm trying to spread that 1,000 grams of chemical across a pretty large surface area. And most horticulturally efficient canopies have a leaf area when they're fully developed of, you know, maybe 3 or 4 hectares. If I take all the leaves off the canopy and I spread them out on the ground, I'd expect to be able to cover 3 to 4 hectares of ground area per planted hectare of canopy with that single-sided leaf area. Because leaves have got 2 sides, I've actually got, you know, maybe 6 to 8 hectares of leaf area to cover. So leaves are the major surface area target that we're trying to hit, but fruit can be quite significant as well. You know, approaching up to a hectare of fruit surface area, depending on the crop. Like grapes have got an amazing surface area because of the numbers of berries and things, very hard to reach. And then wood and other surfaces that are potential targets actually are pretty tiny in area, and usually around 0.1 of a hectare or maybe a little bit more. So if I put a kilo of chemical on, what we see in most horticultural fruit crop canopies is that I would expect to achieve an average deposit of around 2 to 3 millionths of a gram or microgram of chemical per square centimetre of target surface area. And this is the standard deposit theory that we developed in New Zealand to give us an index about spraying efficiency and spraying variability. So it's a good, it's not, if you go to the sort of parties I go to, it's a good number to throw out at a party, but probably might not rock your boat, I don't know. Yeah, dose varies with a whole lot of things. If I try and spread that kilo of product across a smaller surface area and I'm quite accurate in targeting it, my deposit millionths of a gram per square centimetre is going to go up. And early season spraying, when I've got very few leaves and very few leaf obstructions, it's possible that you can put on twice as much chemical deposited if you can actually land it on the target or more. Sprayers vary terribly in their targeting efficiency, and sprays formulations vary quite a lot in their retention efficiency once it's landed on the target. So all of those things affect the dose that you achieve. And my rules of thumb in here is for tree fruit crops, which have already got their scaffold structure present in the orchard, is quite different from most grape canopies, which grow from sticks to something quite significant. But when you've already got the skeleton of the tree in place, what we've measured when we've done tree volume increases is that seasonal growth typically adds about 30% to the volume of traditional freestanding tree forms. So with shoot elongation and things through the season, and then you try and prune the tree back into its allotted space again. So you typically prune about 30%. In older style training systems, you typically prune about 30% of the tree volume back off again at the start of the next season. And when I was doing my PhD work, I guess I was a little bit, not quite a zealot, but I was a bit of a purist, and I tried to get our industry to make an adjustment saying, oh, your trees are 30% smaller at the beginning of the season, so you can get away with 30% less chemical. And then try and reach your full dose by the time you get to flowering when the trees are starting to have grown a bit. And I quite quickly realized from some control failures that that's a bad idea, because most of your new growth happens from bud break through to month or so after flowering. It's the new growth that's particularly susceptible to most pathogens and to quite a lot of pests. And it's the new growth that we really want to protect. And it makes total sense to keep your chemical application rates up, even on developing canopies. And if anything, slightly overspray them in the early season, particularly before flowering, when there's limited risk of residues, unwanted residues on fruit. So I'm quite relaxed about running the same dose of chemical per hectare on a developing tree fruit canopy from bud break through to whenever, to full canopy, just on the basis of hopefully getting a better job done to stop diseases early in the disease cycle, which usually gets a much better result. Having said that, it's totally sensible to adjust your chemical application rates on the basis of how big your trees are. And that's where we're going to get to somewhere along this discussion. I'll go really quickly through this because there are some quite important points here. I think this example's done for kiwi fruit, but it doesn't really matter. Along the bottom axis here, this is showing the maximum potential deposits in terms of millionths of a gram per square centimetre. If I land 100% of what I put out the back of the sprayer on the target, which is obviously possible, but in a perfect world. So if I put a kilo of chemical on per hectare to a dormant canopy, which has got about 0.1 of a hectare of wood surface area, and I landed all of that on the target, I'd be depositing about 100 millionths of a gram per square centimetre of wood surface area. By sometime before flowering, the leaf area index will have got to about 1 hectare of leaves per hectare, and my potential maximum deposit has dropped to something more realistic in the order of maybe 10 micrograms per square centimetre, and then it's just a diminishing. You try to spread that chemical across a bigger surface area as the canopy grows through the season, and your average deposits will go down, which makes sense. I've taken this tail of the graph off here and just ignoring that very early season stage. So we've gone from a scale of 0 to 100 to 0 to 10 now, so that you can actually see the potential effects of increasing canopy surface area on average deposits. So from a leaf area index of 1 through to about 5, your potential deposits, if you landed everything, dropped from about 10 micrograms down to about 2, just because you're spreading it across a bigger surface area. And the expected runoff volume, so the amount of volume needed to wet whatever that target is to the point of drip in a kiwi fruit canopy, but it's similar for apples and other stone fruit, looks something like this curve with the X's. Where the runoff volume starts at something under 1,000 litres a hectare and will increase to something around 3,000 litres a hectare if you've got a big canopy with lots of leaves. Now, the real world says that you'll never deposit everything that you put out the back of the sprayer on the target. And airblast spraying, air-assisted spraying gets bagged a lot in the kind of popular literature, saying it's, one person described it as the most inefficient industrial process on earth, which was pretty harsh, but true somewhat. What we've found when we've measured, done spray budgets to say, this is how much we put out the back of the sprayer, where did it go? How much of it landed on the target? How much of it landed on the ground? How much of it was lost from the block somewhere? And we found that as the canopy develops through the season, your spray retention efficiency, so the percentage of the spray that lands on the target goes up. And if you've got a nice regular planting with minimum gaps, so it's basically a hedgerow of some sort, you can land as much as 90% of what you put out the back of a simple axial fan airblast sprayer on the target when you've got full leaf. But back here at the beginning of the season, you're lucky if you can land 5 to 10% onto dormant plants, and it gets better as you go. So here's my expected retention efficiencies from bare wood to a gappy leaf canopy to a very dense leaf canopy. So 2 to 7% bare wood going up to something in the order of 90%, so 60, 70 to 90% from sometime after flowering in a fully developed canopy. Graphically, it looks like this. So that's the maximum deposit I might expect to get. That's the minimum deposit I might realistically expect to get. And what you actually achieve lies somewhere in between there with lots of variation based on where you are in the canopy. There is a point to all this. There's different growth stages here. So the question and the point is, what happens if I only apply a single rate per hectare on any canopy or any growth stage? I think there's a graph for that. Sorry, that is the question, and here are the answers. The expected deposits, if I put on a constant chemical quantity per hectare, will reduce as the target surface area increases, as the chemicals are being spread over a larger surface area. They get closer to the theoretical maximum as the canopy retention potential increases with increasing leaf area and canopy development. And the widest gap between the deposit levels, the lowest and the highest expected deposits, occur in the early season. And whether you're down at the bottom here getting some pretty average deposits and potentially getting control failures, or whether you're sitting up here where you're actually getting quite high deposits and hopefully getting some good efficacy, depends very, very much on how you set your sprayer up. So that's the most important time at which your sprayer setup is likely to fail you, and we can model that. And I won't go into details there. And I'll stop after this slide, but what does it all mean and what do we need to do about it? To me, spraying is a black art. You get very little feedback as to the efficacy of your individual spray applications, and the time to get that feedback is usually too late to fix it. So you spray, you hope it works, you see whether it works or not after a problem develops or doesn't, and if the problem does develop, it may be too late to fix it. The other part here is that the crop target canopy application needs and grower application rate decisions don't match often. And there's a real potential to join the dots and actually do better in this space. There is a strong case for varying chemical application rates on the basis of your spraying target size and density. And here I'm talking not so much seasonal development as the differences between trees on different training systems or trees at different ages. And all of our countries need a consistent industry language to support consistent and appropriate application rate decisions. And hopefully that's kind of set the scene for where we're at. I'll just stop sharing and take some questions if we can.
So we do have one question here. Could you elaborate on early season sprayer setup in order to improve deposit?
Sure. So I'm just trying to find the slideshow where I'm supposed to be, and I can't. So I'll just find it. And I have got.
We can give you a minute to find it.
Yeah, if you don't mind, just not bore you.
So just to reiterate for people who came in late, all of your labels are on a per 100 liter basis now. Nothing is per hectare.
Yep.
And is there a maximum amount of product that you can apply?
Sorry, there's several different things going on here. For our field crop rates, it's entirely appropriate to prescribe on a hectare basis, and we do that. It's just for fruit and vine crops where you can have these incredible variations in the size and density and form of the canopies that are grown, and avocados would be our most extreme example. It makes no sense to have a fixed hectare rate. So the growers are given a tank mix prescription. The label will say whether they can concentrate spray that or not, or whether they have to dilute spray it. And the growers have absolute freedom of choice in Australia and New Zealand to vary their application volume to adjust their chemical rates for the target canopy. The problem is that it's really easy for spray reps to prescribe on a per hectare basis, and it's really easy trap for an industry to fall into to discuss rates on a per hectare basis. And so you talk to our grape growers, and for years and years and years, they say, oh, sulfur goes on at 3 kilos per hectare. And I'm saying, well, why? And it's the same with the apple growers. Captain goes on at 2.5 kilos a hectare, or whatever the number was. So we slip into the trap of using hectare language, and then it does trap us sometimes. But Australia and New Zealand labels are written on a per 100 litre tank mix rate basis, and sometimes they have some guidance notes saying, use no less than 2,000 litres a hectare, or use no more than whatever. The other thing that we do have on our labels is an entirely separate rate statement, which is based on our Environmental Protection Agency EPA modelling, which prescribes a maximum rate per hectare that we're legally not allowed to exceed, and that's an environmental loading that won't cause, the threshold for causing harm and potential harm in the environment. So it has caused quite a lot of confusion because if they put the maximum rate per hectare on the label too close to the use statements, sometimes that becomes a target. So growers will see that and actually apply the maximum rate, the EPA threshold rate, instead of what they should be, which should be about 3 or 4 or 5 times higher than the recommended label rate. And the other trap that some of our chemical companies have fallen into is they'll first register, it happened with an insecticide here, first register the insecticide in, say, apples, set the EPA maximum threshold rate as appropriate for the maximum that they'd ever use in apples, and then they come into avocados, register it in there, find the tree canopies are sometimes 3 times as big as our modern apple canopies, and the required rate for efficacy in avocados in these massive trees is at or above the EPA maximum use threshold, which has been modelled for apples, not avocados, and so they've got to go and remodel it all and change the labels. Anyway, I'll go back to where I should have been and share this again. Keep talking, Wendy.
We have a few more questions here. Can you multitask?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Go for it.
Okay, Erica, you want to do the next one?
Sure. Yeah, so given that not all the materials, oh, hold on, I just lost my chat here. Okay. Given that not all the materials are equal in how they work, an example is poisons are either active levels or below, but PGRs increase activity as a material is added. Would you approach water per area rate differently for poisons and PGRs?
So I don't actually understand the distinction on PGRs. Do you understand the question, Wendy or Erica?
I'm just reading it now.
What I can say is that there's lots of different modes of actions of chemistry, and so if you've got a systemic product, and Movento would be a classic. You have Movento sold as Movento, I presume, in Canada.
Yep.
Yeah, so Movento is a classic. If you put that on at anything close to the runoff rate, all you're doing is wasting seriously expensive chemical by dropping some of it on the ground. Movento is way best applied at volumes below runoff, and they are pretty coherent on that. It's highly systemic. You need to get it, as I understand it, it's preferentially uptaken through the guard cells and the stomata. So that's its key source of entry into plants. I didn't know this until I made a fool of myself at a meeting a couple of years ago. And because the growers were telling me that that Movento goes in through the stomata, it's on the Bayer's use guide. I said, well, it doesn't sound right to me because the holes in the stomata are way too small for spray droplets to go in through. And then when I talked to Bayer, they said that most of the uptake from Movento happens through these stomatal guard cells for some reason. So yeah, it's really interesting. But so if you've got something that's systemic and it can move around the plant, then your coverage doesn't have to be as good as if you're dealing with an outside acting protectant type product. I don't think you can generalize about PGRs. I think that depending on how they work and where they're absorbed and where they're effective will define how you need to apply them and how you should adjust the rates. The scary thing about PGRs is that if you put them on a too high a rate, they can do serious damage and give you, quite counterproductive outcomes.
Okay, so that was what the question was about.
Yeah.
Was you can, the damage for over applying an insecticide is just economic, but the damage for over applying a PGR can be physiological.
Yeah. So the thing that's driven the whole kind of science of rate adjustment on the basis of your canopy size has been PGRs. So tree row volumes, the whole tree row volume concept, which I'll talk about in a minute, but for those, how familiar is the Canadian industry with tree row volume as a spray adjustment?
Very.
Okay, so I'll talk about it now briefly. Look at the row end profile of the tree. So measure the height, measure the spread. It gets more accurate if you measure the spread at different heights as you go up the tree rather than just measuring an average spread. And so you can work out a cross-sectional area of the end of your tree. And then you just project that down the row. And so how many meters of row have you got per hectare? It's 10,000 square meters in a hectare divided by the row spacing. Gives you how many meters of row you have per hectare. So if I've got 5 meter row spacing, a hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters, so 10,000 square meters. 10,000 divided by 5 is 2,000. So on a 5 meter row spacing, I've got 2,000 meters or 2 kilometers of row length per hectare. If I've got a cross-sectional area at the end of the row, let's say 10 square meters because it's easy maths, and I've got 2,000 meters of that length of row per hectare, 10 times 2,000 is 20,000. I've got a tree row volume in that orchard of 20,000 cubic meters of canopy volume that you're trying to spray into that's potentially got leaf and fruit and things in it. And the whole point about the tree row volume theory is that is a really useful descriptor to define how much spray you need to put on to a hectare, or however you express it, it could be per meter of row, to set your dose of chemical. And so that, I may have got this slightly wrong, but as far as I know, Turner and Sutton did some work in North Carolina in the 1970s, I think it was. And I'm pretty sure it was Sutton's PhD, where he was looking at old school seedling apple trees in North Carolina. It was years since I thought about this, sorry. which were planted on up to 11-meter row spacings and were 7 or more meters taller, giant trees. And the industry back in the 70s was transforming towards clonal rootstocks, and so they're planting things like 793 or 106 or the equivalent, still growing quite large trees, but much smaller, much more precocious, much more intensively planted. And what the industry was finding was that their chemical thinning responses were as variable as anything, way too much, sometimes way too little, sometimes. And they needed some way of adjusting the rates that were being used of products like Cargill on these big old seedling apple trees to work consistently on these new apple tree forms. And trio volume theory came out of that, and the pest and disease part of it followed. So it's usually the plant growth regulators that we see problems with first, and we've got to get those rates right. Meteor is metametron's one of the products which is really widely used for apple thinning in New Zealand now, and you can get an amazing result from it, but you can also drop all your fruit. So the growers are pretty sensitized to making sensible rate adjustments for that. But it's not just rates, it's weather conditions and other things too, and how much, what sort of wood you're spraying as well. Any other questions there?
I think the other one is pretty much addressing the same question of how do we, so Erica, go ahead. I'm stealing your thunder.
Oh, no, that's good. So I'm assuming that you're talking about this grower is having challenges with their canopy expansion throughout the spring, especially at the timing of PGRs for thinning and apogee application. So is there any help with these adjustments?
Again, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. The canopy development's really, really fast. How is apogee working? Is it going in through the leaves?
I'm not familiar with apogee. I don't know if Wendy is.
Well, it's got to go in that way. It wouldn't go in through the roots, so it's going in through the leaves somehow.
Yeah, again, I may not be answering the right question, but I can tell you a little bit because I did lots of this work in apples, counted lots and lots and lots of leaves over the years. The rate of new leaf emergence in an apple canopy where a great percentage of the leaf area comes from non-expanding spurs. So you get a bud that breaks and it produces 3, 4, maybe 5 leaves, and it may or may not put out a bush shoot. And you have the shoot tips which elongate out. So you get this amazing flush of growth in a deciduous tree canopy, and apples are reasonably complicated with their different leaf forms. And the rate of new emergence in the spring at bud break in an apple canopy averages about 1 new leaf per shoot per day. And there's a whole lot of different shoot types working together. And so over that very early spring period, at green tip through to the sort of spur leaf development before, and when the flower buds start to become visible, you get this incredibly rapid leaf emergence, and your crop is going to outgrow its protectant cover. I'm talking about fungicides here, like scab fungicides. It's going to outgrow its fungicide cover very, very quickly. And so you need a relatively short spraying interval to maintain cover to protect new growth. Typically, the rule of thumb has been 7 to 10 days through the spring, and trying to cover ahead of wet periods. And then everything slows down a bit, and you start to see most of your new leaf emergence coming from expansion shoots, either bush shoots or terminal expansion shoots. And the average rate of new leaf emergence on those, while they're still elongating, drops to something close to 1 per week. Now, it may happen a lot faster in Canada where you get really good synchronized winter chilling and everything, but those are the sorts of numbers that we see in New Zealand. And then if we're trying to develop a new canopy, we try and keep it growing for as much of the season as we can, and we typically see about 1 new leaf appearing on expansion shoots per week through the season. And again, that kind of defines the spray program that you need to run to protect that new growth. And for fungicides, you can often extend your application intervals out to 14 to 21 days, depending on the season and depending on the disease that you're chasing. like I said, I'm not familiar enough with apogee to quite understand the questions. So.
No, that's completely fine. It's a bit of a more specific question, but we do have a question here that we were cut off a bit earlier, but if you could elaborate on early season sprayer setup to improve your deposits.
Oh, yeah, yes, so that's coming
Yeah.
down in here. So hold that question and hopefully it will make some sense. If I don't pick it up later on, can you remind me?
Yes, for sure.
I was going to add something else just before. Oh, that's right. Sorry. I don't know how tied up in knots your industry is over fruit residues. In New Zealand, because we grow far more fruit than we consume with 5 million people, our industry is built around export. We export something like, I think, 95% of the apples that we grow, or 90% of. Much less so with stone fruit, but cherries definitely. And because we export to lots of different markets, we have to meet lots of different residue restrictions that are imposed by different markets. And getting wine into Canada is one of our toughest markets in the world. We have developed spray programs in the apple industry. So we've gone from our old way of growing apples was heavily dependent on organophosphate insecticides and carbamates, and quite a lot of the older fungicides like mancozebs and thyrams and things, coppers. And in the 90s, we recognized that what we were doing was completely unsustainable. We had most of our spraying was for control of insect pests that we'd actually induced with the chemicals that we were using. I'm sure this is a familiar story. So lots of miticides, lots of things like frog's apple, leafhopper, and other mealybugs as induced pests. And we were losing efficacy with the organophosphates against the key pests that we really had to control, which was some leaf rollers, cobbing moth, things like that. And so we did this big conversion of the industry. So the industry branched into organics or integrated fruit production, and about 10% of our industry is organic, which is a tough gig. It's relatively wet here, but 90-odd% of it is growing under an integrated fruit production program, which has taken out all of the broad spectrum insecticides and looks at quite strategic use of insect growth regulators and mating disruption and targeted applications around insect growth stages. I was part of that program working as a pathologist, and we thought that we needed to reduce fungicide inputs to be green and to follow this integrated fruit production philosophy. So through the 90s, we were doing this. And it's, the disease control that you need is dictated by the environment that you're trying to grow fruit in and the susceptibility of the varieties that you've got and the diseases that you've got, obviously. And we found it was actually really hard to reduce the absolute numbers of fungicides, and it stopped being a goal for us. But we wanted to be able to justify the fungicides that we were using and to maximize their efficacy, and particularly to maximize their life in terms of not getting resistance developing. And we've been a little bit successful with that, but we use quite a lot of fungicides in our spray programs in New Zealand because it is a wet climate. It's not like Washington State or bits of Australia. What we're currently looking at is how can we walk this tightrope between overusing chemicals and leaving residues on the crop and maintaining effective and sustainable control. And spray application methodology is becoming a critical part of that strategy. So currently, to get apples into Europe, the European supermarkets impose these completely arbitrary and largely meaningless MRL restrictions on our growers. And they say, we won't accept your fruit if it's got more than, say, 10% of the MRL that we recognize for that product, which is a complete abuse of the MRL system and philosophy and science. Anyway, that's what they want, and they'll accept. So the kind of basic tenets of our apple exports into Europe is no more than 3 detectable residues on the fruit at no more than 10% of the MRL for those residues, which is a pretty hard target. And so we've got to be really careful about what we put on when and at what rates. And sadly, that screw's tightened a lot. And the goal of the industry, our New Zealand apple industry, is to grow effectively residue-free fruit, which is a pretty almost unscalable mountain, and, especially as detection techniques get better and better. But we're actually looking much more to sophistication and application technology to achieve that target. So one of the things that so this is the start of a big 7-year research program, hopefully that will get funded. It's being bid now and it'll hopefully get funded. But one of the targets of that program is to say, okay, why do residues occur? What actually causes them? And so when you spray, you put on your kilo of active per hectare, and you deposit about 2 millionths of a gram of chemical onto per square centimetre of fruit. At that 2 millionths of a gram, that might be an effective dose of the chemical. If your application rate is 3 kilos a hectare, or it'll be probably 6 to 9 micrograms per square centimetre. And if your application rate for a modern fungicide is only 100 grams per hectare, it'll be a fraction of that. But whatever that effective rate is, you achieve that effective dose, but it doesn't last very long. So the chemical that you've applied gets reduced by growth dilution. The fruit grows, the leaves grow, new tissues emerge that aren't protected. It gets broken down by UV light, it gets washed off, it gets degraded by bacteria and things that actually use that chemical for food. And a feature of all of the modern chemistry that we apply, except for copper mostly these days, I'm presuming you're not using any lead products or like that in Canada. So copper is the only product that we apply that doesn't have a clear breakdown path in the environment. Pretty much all of the other pesticides that we use are designed to break down over a relatively short period of time in the environment. That's why we're allowed to use them. And the stuff that you see as residues on fruit detected in market is at some tiny fraction of the control level residue that we are trying to achieve when we spray. And often it's quite tightly bound into the waxes of the fruit, and it has a really slow degradation profile. So there was a point to all of that discussion, that's that one of the things that we're experimenting with that we're really interested in is that if you spray at the point of runoff, or even worse, if you spray using a volume that's about half the point of runoff, where you've got twice as much chemical per litre of spray mix that goes on, or per drop that lands, to achieve the same rate per hectare, when you're spraying at that sort of half dilute or full dilute spray volume, you will tend to get drip points forming on your fruit, on the fruit that's on the outside of the canopy that receives the most spray. And it's impossible to avoid that. And when you're using the old wettable powder sprays, you'd often see that as a powdery residue. It's an obvious drip point residue on the bottom of the fruit. And the same thing occurs if that fresh residue gets a bit of rainfall on it, a bit of dew on it, and it re-wets, it's reactivated, but it can actually move towards the bottom of the fruit and leave these drip points. And what we're finding empirically, and I'm pretty sure it's going to stack up, is that when you get those caked residue deposits in a drip point, you are potentially leaving a residue tail on your fruit residue curve. So it will be at a fraction of the control level, but it's more likely to be detected as a 110-day residue, where it could have been a 50-day residue if that hadn't actually occurred, which makes a hell of a difference for getting fruit into market with no residues on it. And what we've found is the coolest technology for improving coverage of sprays, particularly concentrate sprays, and to almost eliminate these drip point residues is the organosilicon surfactant. So when we mix an organosilicon surfactant, and if you can bear with me later, I'll actually find a video of showing, actually demonstrating this, if I can hunt for it. Didn't think to load it up in advance. When you apply a spray with an organosilicon surfactant at an appropriate rate in it, it seriously lowers the surface tension of the spray mix. And so you get amazing spreading potential out of it. And if a drip point forms on the bottom of the fruit, and this effect can last for some days after application with the organosilicons. It will either drip off, or as that drip point starts to dry out, or sorry, as the rest of the fruit surface starts to dry out and the drip point remains wet, the organosilicon will cause the liquid in the drip point to whip back onto the fruit, and you won't actually see these drip points form. So I've gone off on a complete tangent with adjuvants and things, but it's trying to say that application technology is starting to feature more and more in market acceptable spray programs. And the other end of the application technology that's becoming critical for us is the whole management of spray drift and keeping the spray within your property. And so they're both factors that we need to deal with. So it's getting a bit outside of what goes wrong. Any questions come in? I've been talking to myself.
No, there's no new ones.
I want to. I thought this would be of interest. Let's just talk about the distribution of spray out of an airblast sprayer.
So David, have you addressed the how do we take a per hectare rate and make it a per volume rate? Have you addressed that? Are we going to? Because that's the question that I get more than any other question.
Okay, I'll since I've started down this track, so I was going to do that first. I probably haven't done it well enough. Can I just talk about the output distribution from nozzlings and sprayers and then come back to that?
Yep. Cool. We'll just use this as a teaser to keep them here. Yeah,
it's just that I've just loaded this, so it'll take me ages to find another one. Can you see that? Spray plume management, nozzle output arrangements.
Yes.
So this is some really, really old work. So it's for an ag chem training course that we ran for sprayer calibrators. And sorry, I'll stop sharing and see if I can get the thing working. Share it and then open it. I did it in the wrong order. Do this time. You see that okay?
Yep.
I presume that most of this audience is, freestanding deciduous tree canopies.
Yeah, there's a shift going into trellising for at least for pome fruit.
What sort of trellising?
Posts and wires. I need somebody who's a tree fruit grower to talk about it. What is the question? They're on dwarfing rootstocks.
Yeah, and so you need
density planting
wires to stop them tipping over.
Yep.
But you haven't gone as far as something like an Ebro Espaliad type canopy.
Nope, I don't think so yet.
So these kind of rules of thumb work for trees that are free to arrange themselves in space, where they branch and they're behaving naturally. As soon as you start to try and contain a deciduous tree canopy into a horizontal cordon, like the monks' gardens in Europe and things, spraying rules just fall out the window, and you've got to treat them as something completely different.
Observation from a grower is fruiting well with narrow canopies is some of the newer plantings.
What's happening in New Zealand is we're going to these really two-dimensional canopies, often on a V trellis, quite a vertical, quite an upright V trellis. And we're finding we have all of these old rules about spraying, that dose adjustment and nozzle output arrangements and things, they're not working anymore. And we're in this big transition where we are getting some pretty wacky results with some of the plant growth regulators, and we're having to reset around a whole new tree form. So last time we did that was back in the mid-90s, and 20 years further on, it's happening again. And I wanted to end this session with the technology that will support us through that, because we've come so far with scanning to measure and adjust things. But there's some quite interesting questions for people who've got more traditional trees that are hopefully answered a bit here. And then we'll come back to that whole rate adjustment thing. But the short answer for the rate adjustment thing is use one of the recognized rate adjustment systems. Tree row volume works really well. And don't sweat the small stuff. Yeah, I will answer that now, and then I'll answer it again because people forget this. So what we're looking to try and do typically with the range of canopies that you might see in most modern orchards is, say that canopy is smaller than the block next door, I can put about 30% less chemical on there with absolute confidence that it's going to work, because there is 30% less tree there to spray. And so usually we anchor around a reference canopy that's the most typical one in the industry and say, okay, we're getting really good success putting on thinning product at that rate. This block here is 30% smaller, so we'll put 30% less product on. This other block here is 30% bigger, we'll put 30% more product on, and I try not to make adjustments much beyond plus minus 30% from the rate which is working well on the most common canopy in the industry. So plus or minus 30% is a sensible sort of adjustment for tree row volume. There's a real temptation. We've got a new apple growing area up in Gisborne, which is 3.5 hours north of Napier where I am. So they're growers that are new to apple growing. They're growing a new variety, Envy, with monster fruit. They're growing very well, but they're getting all sorts of disease problems. And when we looked into it, powdery mildew particularly, when we looked into it, because they've got these young orchards, they were spraying every second row, alternate row spraying, using half of the product rate per hectare, because they perceived that their trees were tiny and didn't need much chemical. And they set themselves up for powdery mildew problems that's taken them probably 2 seasons to clean up. So they got, terminal shoots with serious mildew, and what they did was said, oh, these trees are quite little. I only need to put on maybe 300 litres a hectare dilute, which is bullshit, frankly, and because of the spraying inefficiencies. And so they had put that on when in every second row spray. And so they failed in coverage and they failed in dose. So my number one rule of thumb with dose adjustment is, if the canopy that you're looking at appears to require half or less of the chemical application that the successful, the most common canopy is successfully sprayed at, don't go below half. It never go below half of the expected application rate that's standard in your industry at the time. So 30% reduction is pretty safe. 50% reduction is starting to get dangerous, and less than a 50% reduction is just stupid.
Is that assuming excellent coverage though? Because I get scared with cutting back rates of fungicides, especially when you're looking at 100 grams per hectare.
Yeah, you always need to try and achieve excellent coverage. And if you can't achieve excellent coverage at a low volume, the simplest and crudest way to improve coverage is to increase your spray volume. Usually it's some other factor that's at work. A mistake that our grape growers made as they made this transition away from the old 10-foot row spacings, big gnarly canopies with really simple non-air assisted sprayers with Massotti guns on them, was a whole new crop of growers came into the industry who were using modern air-assisted vertical boom sprayers that really target the canopy well, and they completely mistook coverage for dose. And so where the accepted wisdom in our grape industry was about 1,000 litres a hectare as a runoff volume for our traditional canopies, these growers were looking at these fine droplet sprays out of really, really sexy air-assisted sprayers that could target the canopy, and they're saying, but look, my coverage is amazing at 300 litres a hectare. And it took quite a lot of failures to convince people that 300 litres a hectare with good coverage in a canopy that probably needs something like 1,000 litres a hectare to wet it to the point of runoff is going to be underdosing to the point of control failure. And that's getting down to a third of the typically recommended application rate. So it's amazing what you can get away with chemicals in terms of dose variability. And I've already talked about that because there's already this sort of inherent 2 to 3-fold variation in dose across the within the canopies anyway. And so if you do come in and you spray a canopy with a systematically underdose, it's quite likely that so say you come in and you spray your apple trees with a third of the industry recognized acceptable dose. It's likely that the outside of the tree will still receive a deposit level which will give you a reasonable degree of efficacy. And if that deposit isn't challenged by extreme weather or extreme disease pressure, chances are you'll see reasonable disease control. But what will happen is it won't have any real persistence because it'll weather away quicker, and the inner parts of the canopy will be quite underdosed, and if you come under pressure, you'll see failure. So there is a huge margin for error, but it's not one to abuse. Does that sound sensible to you, Wendy?
Yeah, it's hard. It's difficult because if you have control failures and you've reduced the rate below, and if the label says X kilos per hectare and you have reduced the rate, you're not going to exceed the MRL, but if you have a control failure, you have no leg to stand on with the chemical company. And that's the risk that you have to take.
Yep. And unfortunately, that's just the reality of the regulators painting your industry into a corner.
David, how did your industry go from rate per hectare to rate per volume? How did that happen?
Rate per volume came before rates per hectare. So, traditionally, when you go right back to pesticide research, this is how the research is done, and the products have been prescribed on a volume basis.
Yep.
And the problem is that tree and vine fruit industries are a tiny user of global chemicals. And almost all of the global chemical rates are prescribed for spraying out of a boom sprayer to an area. And so the whole hectare acre thinking dominates the ag chem industry. And we're kind of a bit stuck with it. And I'll show you something later if we've got time about the hoops that the Europeans have had to jump through, because the EU legislation, so the old English labels were based on, as I understand it, a volume-based prescription, and that's where ours have come from, out of the English system. And then under the EU laws, the fruit growers got caught up in harmonisation of chemical labels, and all of the EU product labels are written on a hectare basis. And to be able to legally apply under the recommended product rate, there's a whole rate adjustment system based on canopy description, which I'll show you later on if we've got time.
Okay.
And you should probably look at it. It's going to be easier to fight that fight in Canada, where what that does is protects your growers, because the chemical industry will accept that if your canopy looked like this at that growth stage, you can get away with less, and so you still get that product support. But
but they don't sell as much chemical.
I don't care about that, because it's a self-adjusting thing. You guys need the chemicals. If you use less, the price will go up. It's just a demand supply thing. So don't worry about using less chemical. You'll still get stung for it. So if you're an early adopter, you might actually save some money, but don't reduce chemical rates solely on the basis of saving money. Because if the whole industry does it, the market will just adjust. Unless you can buy the product. This is what happens in Europe: is the fruit growers buy a cereal product, which is a fraction of the price of the apple registered product, and it's very hard for the market to prove that.
My growers would never do that.
The trouble comes though when you use an incorrectly formulated product for your crop and you wreck your crop, and then you don't deserve to have any comeback. The worst case of that in New Zealand have actually been using plant formulations on animals, which was a criminal conviction. Anyway, that's by the by.
Take us where you want to go.
Okay, just this was some work that I actually did from a PhD, and I was looking at it this morning and thinking, yeah, that's kind of interesting. Because what proportion of your sprayers are just traditional axial fan air blasts? So it's just a ring fan pushing the air out, drawing it in from behind or in front, and then pushing it out more or less sideways and with a ring of nozzles.
The vast majority.
Okay, so this is relevant. So this is just talking about nozzle arrangements for freestanding deciduous tree fruit canopies, and ignore any Australian type canopies. So, and remember, this is 1990s thinking, which mostly still applies. So there's no standards. I don't know if you have any rules in Canada, but there's certainly no rules in New Zealand that says how you, we have these guidelines which say how much volume you might need to put onto different canopies, but there's nothing that tells the growers how they need to put it out of each nozzle. And the old guidelines that came out of the States, and some really good research out of the States, was project 2/3 of your spray from the top third of the sprayer to the top third of the tree if you're spraying multi-litre trees. And when our growers tried to take that prescription into single litre tree guidelines, it's just stupid. And so what we adopted instead was, and this was one of the outcomes of lots and lots of spraying deposit experiments where we measured deposits through the tree, is that in single litre trees, it's far more appropriate to project 2/3 of the spray from the top half of the sprayer to the top half of the tree. So single litre trees is a different output distribution. And again, don't sweat the small stuff. 2/3 is 60 to 70%. And you'll never get it perfectly accurate because of where your nozzles are relative to the tree. But it's saying project more to the top, because quite a lot of the deposit that we see in the bottoms of trees comes from spray which is projected into the tops. And in a spraying operation, as you drive past the tree, the spray laden air is being projected to the tree quite quickly. The typical exit speed of the droplets and the air from a normal air blast sprayer is in the order of 20 to 30 meters per second. And it falls off exponentially with distance from the sprayer. And there's a whole lot of stuff about this in Sprayers 101, the Air Blast 101 book, about seeing that you've got effective air relative to your travel speed and throw distance. It's absolutely brilliant how Jason's described it. But the theory is that if your spray droplets are moving at more than about 12 meters a second, so 1 meter a second, 3.6 kilometers an hour, 10 meters a second, 36 kilometers per hour. So you can imagine a 30, 40 kilometer an hour wind. If the spray droplets are moving faster than that, their deposit, particularly on fruit, will be very bad because they'll tend to entrain around the fruit rather than deposit onto it. And so the idea is to project the spray from the sprayer with a reasonable velocity to get it up to the tops of the trees, and to have that spray slow down in the tree and then sediment out through the tree. And so you get some active projection up into the tree, which if the spray is slowed down enough will deposit quite well. And the droplets that miss there, if you park them in the plume, and park the plume in the canopy rather than in the interrow, so you don't want to see too much air, you'll get sedimenting deposits down through the tree, which will seriously add to your spray deposit. And so the critical thing, and this is the point down the bottom here, is that you do this by a visual setup. You park the sprayer in the row that you're going to spray. You turn off all the nozzles, which are obviously going to miss the target and just be spraying into the air. It really annoys me when I see sprayer operators coming out of a block of bigger trees and go straight into a block of smaller trees and don't bother to turn off a couple of nozzles at the top, because most of that spray will fall on the ground in the interrow. We know from experiment that that's what happens. And so you're kind of fooling yourself if you think, oh, it's going to drift off across the orchard and give you good coverage. You're spraying the row that you're in. and you want to maximize the deposit potential in the row that you're in by reaching the tops of the trees, projecting about 1 meter beyond it, but not reaching to the next row over unless you're trying to alternate row spray. So the question there I was asking back in the 90s was, does this apply to, that rule of thumb apply to tower sprayers? You move the air and the spray up closer to the tree, and to thin hedgerows, and probably a little bit less where we see that even nozzling isn't such a bad thing with a tower sprayer, but I still like to bias some of the output to the tops. Anyway, the experiment, sorry, this is just a graphic showing 2/3 of the spray from the top third of the nozzles to the top third of a multi-litre tree. And that's the kind of output distribution that I normally would set up a sprayer for. Well, we've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Got 9 nozzles and 1 turned off at the top or the bottom, because most of our sprayers back then had 10 nozzles aside. So I've turned one off that wasn't going to work, and I've got 9 nozzles to play with, and I've put 2 large output nozzles into this part of the tree, and less down here, which is a fairly typical output pattern. And that's delivering, out of those top 3 nozzles, that's 2/3 of the output to a multi-litre, which would be stupid in a single litre, because a lot of that's going to project over the tops and be lost. And so there's a more appropriate setup for a single litre, where I've got 2/3 of the spray out of the top half of the nozzles to the top half of the tree. So in practice, this is what actually happens. I was just saying, should we be describing what nozzle sprayers fit to sprayers, and growers said no, and we said no. So it's really up to you guys to work out what you need, but we can advise on it.
David, there was a comment that there are a lot of tower sprayers in the orchards.
Yeah, well, that's the way everything's going. And quite honestly, and here's another rule of thumb for you: airblast sprayers are amazingly effective until the height of the canopy is more than the row spacing, and then they start to fail dismally in the tops of trees. So if you've got a 3.5 meter row spacing and you're growing a 4.5 meter tree, buy a tower sprayer, or put some extra nozzles up there, or extend it somehow, because your tops of trees will be compromised, because it's really hard for the sprayer to get through the canopy that's close to it to spray the tops, and the trees get too tall. Anyway, I'll take you through this experiment. So these are our old traditional tree forms. This is a row spacing, 5 meter row spacing. There's the sprayer sitting there. This is a tree row volume measurement graphic of the tree that we were actually spraying. And I do these experiments using food coloring, and so you put food coloring in the tank at a known concentration, and then you spray, and then you go back and sample leaves. In this case, I'd sample 5 leaves out of each of these inner and outer canopy zones at different heights. So that's, I've just broken the tree into thirds and taken leaves out of here and out of here and out of here. And you wash the leaves and you recover the food coloring, which is really water soluble, and then you can quantify how much is in there with a spectrophotometer, which is a cheap analytical technique, and I can express that. If I measure the area of leaves, I can say how much deposit occurred. And so what I've done is I've nozzled up this sprayer, which is just a standard axial fan airblast sprayer. I'll show you what it looks like in a second, with some fine droplet hollow cone nozzles, 80-degree hollow cones, and some really jetty, this is a D556 T-jet nozzle, so it's got quite large droplets. It's a solid cone, very projecting, and would definitely be squirting. This nozzle would be squirting over the top of the tree, so some of that flume would be going right over. And then I've sampled leaves out of all of these zones in these trees with a pair of nozzles working just in the very top of the sprayer, and measured the deposits and where they were in the tree. And I've said, okay, where was the highest deposit? That's a bit with a red box around it. And I've given that a number of 1. And then these deposits around here, that's 80% in the top of the tree. So the deposit in the top of the tree from the top 2 fine droplet hollow cone nozzles was 80% of what I achieved in the shoulder of the tree that I was trying to spray through. So the shoulder of the tree is already starting to compromise my upper canopy deposits. The deposits in the middle here, largely through fallout, are about half what the outside was getting, and there's quite a lot of fallout on the back side of the tree. And this is the average of both sides of the sprayer working, so any wind effects are averaged out here. And there's bugger all of the deposit from the top two nozzles in the bottom of the tree, but there is some interesting fallout, which really surprised me. With the big droplet jetty nozzle, my coverage in the tops wasn't quite as good. I've got the same highest deposit level and relatively little fallout. So the next graph is the next pair of nozzles around, and the fine droplets in the top number 3 and 4 nozzle position out of possible 10 are still contributing quite a lot to the tops. This outside bit's still getting oversprayed. My deposits here are starting to go up a bit, and the jetty nozzles are really spraying the part of the canopy that they're pointed at. We're still overspraying that shoulder of the tree. So that's nozzle positions 5 and 6 now. I'm really losing deposits in the top. And this is a fresh piece of rose sprayed each time. The jetty nozzles are starting to push right through into the center of the tree, which is really interesting. And the finer droplets not quite so well. And when I'm looking at, I think it's so it's 5 pairs of nozzles there. So you can see this output distribution. And the important points to recognize here is that the spray that you put into the top does contribute to what goes into the bottom, and so hence the bias towards the top. That's what the sprayers, they're both straightening vane sprayers, but that's the type of sprayer that I was using. This one here didn't have straightening vanes on it, but it's a 920 millimeter diameter fan. Going quite slowly, only 4 kilometers, 3.8 kilometers now. It's a Royal Gala. It's at full canopy. It would have been just after harvest, and this is April 1996, so it's going back a long time ago. And that sprayer, when I measured the air from it, it's producing about close to 50,000 cubic meters of air per hour. It's not a massive amount of air, but it's significant, and it's absolutely appropriate for that travel speed. So then the question was, how important is straightening vane? So if you've got a vane spray, if you've got a tower spray, you want to have even air from either side, and some kind of vaning is going to be critical. Frankly, if you've got an airblast sprayer, you really should look to fit straightening vanes to it because they're quite compromised without. For those of you that, I always ask the question, which way do fans run on airblast sprayers? And I'm pretty sure there's no Coriolis effect in the northern and southern hemisphere. And I'm pretty sure your sprayers will run counterclockwise when you look from behind. So they'll be turning that way, which means that they'll be lifting on the right-hand side and dumping on the left-hand side. And the weak area of any airblast sprayer with a counterclockwise rotating fan is the top quadrant in the right-hand side when you're spraying into the wind. And they'll get blown out of that very, very easily if you don't have straightening vanes on an axial fan. So this is the effect of the lifting and dumping sides of an airblast sprayer with no straightening vanes on it. So I'm on the dumping side now, and I can't actually remember which nozzles I'm using. Oh, it's a long time ago. And I haven't written on there. How bad is that? Oh, the yellow, obviously, is there. So this is the fine droplet nozzles. So on the dumping side, I've got quite nice deposits in the top, and on the lifting side, I'm a bit compromised. And that pretty much told the story for me that there is a significant difference in sprayer performance from one side to the other when you don't have straightening vanes. And what you've got to do is spray to the conditions. So you really want to look to see the spray plume pushing through and above the canopy on the right-hand side when it's spraying into the wind. And if you can't achieve that, slow down, or consider stop spraying, or go from concentrate spraying to dilute spraying, so you've got more water volume to push. And again, Jason and Mark have done some wonderful stuff in the Airblast 101 book, talking about air management and how to visualize it. I won't worry about kiwi fruit. No one's interested in kiwi fruit, are they? What I will say, in the absence of any feedback, is
I said only to eat.
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear that. You must have. What we found in kiwi fruit. So this is a schematic of a pergola kiwi fruit on a 4-meter row spacing. Is one of the big orchard management operations. We have these big pack house groups that contract fruit from a whole lot of different growers and have their own orchards. They decided that they could settle onto what they called was like a Billy Basic sprayer nozzling, so they nozzle all of their sprayers the same. And here's the output from this kiwifruit sprayer. So the number one position here was 15% of the output, and then they put 28% of the output out of these three nozzles. And to spray different row spacings with the same volume per hectare, which is entirely appropriate for a kiwifruit canopy because it covers a hectare, they changed travel speed on different rows. So they did 6.2 kilometers an hour on 4 meter rows, 8.4 on 3 meter rows, and 5 kilometers an hour on 5 meters rows without adjusting their nozzling. And the effect of that, so this is what we'd recommend as a nozzle output recommendation. So when I write prescriptions for different crops and industries, we often do it using a kind of a graphic like this, saying, you know, on a 4 meter row spacing with a typical industry nozzle sprayer, you know, you can use 4 out of your maybe 7 or 8 available nozzles. And here's the kind of output distribution that we'd recommend. And you'll see that where the orchard was doing 28% output out of this bottom nozzle, we'd be a bit higher than that because you're actually trying to cover a bigger area of canopy at a further distance, and it needs more spray volume to do that safely. But for the 4 meter row spacings, what the orchard was doing and what Zespri, our grower group coordinator, was recommending are pretty similar. But on the 3 meter row spacings, which is in the schematic here, we'd have a markedly different recommended distribution from what the orchard was doing. And on the 5 meter row spacing, we'd be different again, and we'd actually have the opportunity to turn on an extra nozzle, and this grower group wasn't. And they failed. They got all sorts of pest and disease problems that we put down completely to completely inappropriate nozzling and output distributions relative to the target. That's the guts of the message. Is if you have a different canopy, park the sprayer in the row and have a think about which nozzles you can use and what output distribution you want to achieve in that canopy. And just to finish that, air management is the single most poorly addressed part of spraying. How many of your growers use spray rate controllers? As in, you put in a target rate per hectare, and as your travel speed changes, the sprayer sticks to it, the target delivery rate by.
Anybody that uses one, apparently it's pretty common.
Yeah. My concern with those as we move, and again, I can't speak for your industry, but what's happening in our industry is that we're getting more and more kind of corporatized. There's fewer big pack house entities that people grow for. You know, we've gone from 100 and something apple pack houses to 15 or something ridiculous. Or I can't remember. It's those sorts of numbers. It might be 300 pack houses gone to 15. And so they dictate a lot more, and it's far more contract growing. And what we're seeing is the owner operators are starting to fade out of the industry, and it's employed labor that drives the sprayers. And one of the scariest things I see with them, every time we put a rate controller, is they start to drive faster because they can, or they think they can. And so you'll get a young, it's usually young guys under 25 who are really kind of tentative when they start driving a sprayer and they follow the rules. And then as they get more confident, they put their foot down with the foot throttle as they go down the road. And you know, we were talking to exactly this situation in an apple orchard earlier this season, where the operator was pushing up to 13 kilometers an hour down apple rows, and then slowing down and actually changing gears down to slow down for the turns, and then speeding up again. And he was right outside of the controller specs. 13 Ks in those trees is just nuts, and the air delivery would have failed, and he wouldn't be spraying the tops of the trees anymore. And you know, that kind of behavior is just a recipe for failure. And air management is often one of the biggest, or a lack of air management is often one of the biggest failures, either too much air or too little air. And you can balance it up. And as I said before, there's a whole lot of cues to look for, and Jason and Mark have done a wonderful job of describing those, how to visualize it, because it's really complicated interactions. it's almost impossible to prescribe for from without going out in the orchard and seeing what the sprayer actually does. And so it's a perfect thing for field days and for actually working to assess the sprayer, which is probably a good point to jump on to that whole kind of visualization thing. I'll just change what I'm sharing. Stop sharing.
So a comment, 60 to 70% are using the rate controllers.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they're great. They're a wonderful tool, particularly if you're on hills. What I'm picking for the future is we'll see increased use of rate controllers, but they'll be following prescription maps to deliver variable rate on the basis of canopy size, and won't worry so much about the travel speed. So you could actually invert the function of an existing spray rate controller, which senses how fast you're going and maintains the litres per minute required from the nozzles to deliver the target application rate, either in litres per 100 metres or litres per hectare. And so as travel speed slows down, pressure drops away, and as travel speed speeds up, pressure increases. And with an appropriately nozzled spray, you can get plus or minus 15% of your average application rate across a range. You can increase by 15. You could increase travel speed or decrease travel speed by about 15% and control for that. I think that the variable rate spraying on maps is going to be a far more important tool for the future. I'll just start sharing again. Let's see where it is. It's this one. I'm getting better at this. Can you see that one okay?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. So this goes back to when I was working for Hort Research. I haven't worked for them since 2003, so this is old as well. Hort Research, the government was at the time the government research extension agency. So tree row volume, widely accepted in tree crop canopies, and there's tree row volume rules for spraying avocados, apples, citrus. There's lots of dose adjustment methods, but they're all based on similar concepts. There's a fruit wall area system. There's other indices like tree row volume, which are quite useful. And again, Jason's done a wonderful job of covering off these different methods in the book. And the simplest way to do tree row volume is if you've got a nice regular profile of canopy, be it a rectangle or a circle or whatever, you just measure the spread at half the crown height, and measure the row width and measure the height of the crown that you're trying to spray. I tend not to, I ignore the stuff down below if you've got a big gap between the ground and the canopy. And you work out your row and profile, and as I said, project it down the row, work out how many cubic meters of canopy volume you've got to spray per hectare, row volume, and you can work out an application rate. And so a colleague and I did a survey of tree row volumes in New Zealand canopies, and this was this is real numbers from us going out and measuring trees like that. And so we went from small trees to large trees, with a tree row volume of about 12,000 cubic meters, that will be about 14,000 cubic meters of canopy per hectare, up to, I don't know, probably over 40,000 cubic meters of canopy. So what you're looking at in this graph here, here's the tree row volume, sorry. So it's about 13,000 cubic meters up to 40,000 cubic meters of tree row volume per hectare. There's the spray volume that we predicted should have been applied to those canopies based on being able to cover 1 litre of dilute spray, covering about 11 cubic meters of canopy volume wet to the point of runoff. And here are the volumes that the growers were actually putting on. So the whole industry at that stage was anchored around about 2,000 litres a hectare for most canopies, and some growers were still on those old 2,500 litre a hectare dilute spray rates, and a few were up at 2,500, 2,200 to 2,000. So most of the industry dilute was putting on quite different rates from what we would have expected for the size of canopies. And the big question here was, are these small trees, which are receiving 2,000 plus litres a hectare, being oversprayed? And are these larger trees, which are only receiving 2,000 odd litres a hectare and potentially need twice as much, being undersprayed? And what will the efficacy of plant growth regulators be in those sorts of trees? And the guts of it really was the potential for reductions is in these small trees. The bigger trees, going to the very large volumes that might have been prescribed, wasn't so critical, because in the early season they weren't being undersprayed too much, which might answer your question before, Wendy. So even though the growers were technically underdosing some of these larger trees, in the early season canopy, the lack of leaf area actually compensated for that quite a lot. And the spray retention efficiency in some of these larger canopies really helped to compensate. So tree row volume isn't a linear thing, and making big adjustments at the extremes of the canopies that you might see in the industry isn't sensible, which is what I was trying to say before about don't cut your dose too much on small trees. So this is the kind of prescription that we give to our growers now. So this is a 2009 fact sheet on spraying. And we're trying to take the hectare out of their thinking by prescribing on a distance basis. So how much spray does that target need per 100 metres of row? And you'll see more and more of this happening around the world. And it's a whole lot easier to write controller programs for, because they don't have to factor in the row width. They can just work on how far they've travelled. And so there's some really simple adjustment guidelines which you can build for a definite range of canopies. So if you say, okay, I'm going to talk about the freestanding apple canopies that you find in Canada, across that range of canopies forms that you have right now, you can use tree height as a really good index for how much you need to spray, and then the density of the canopy. So if you've got a nice open canopy and you only need a light cover, you can cover something between 14 and 17 cubic meters of tree row volume per litre of spray. If you've got a dense canopy or you need saturation cover, you might need to put on twice as much. So that's down to the product you're using, how dense the canopy is, and what sort of coverage you need to achieve. And somewhere in this middle range is the safe zone. And if you're starting to say I've got a really open canopy and it's really short, you might be starting to get to the point where you fall off the edge and failure happens. And so usually we take the edges off these tables so that growers can't go too extreme. And in practice, this is what some of our trees look like. So that's, again, remember this is 10, 11, 12 years ago. So those were the kind of modern dwarf canopies that we were evolving into. And we see more and more and more of these in the industry right now. That's spraying yellow food coloring, if you're wondering why the spray looks so weird coming out the back. There's a bushier sort of medium density tree, and there's a more traditional large tree that's looking down the row, and this is looking across the row, so you can get some sense of how dense that canopy is. And so what we're saying here is that in a canopy like this, about 30 litres per 100 metres of row should wet that to the point of runoff. 3.5 metre row spacing. So all of these trees are on 3.5 metre row spacings. That relates to about 850 litres a hectare. There's this bigger tree that needs about, whatever that is, 15% more than this one. And the bigger, denser ones are getting up around 1,200 litres a hectare, seems to work quite well for most chemicals. Here's another one looking at some of our more traditional tree forms. There's a typo in there, that should be 5 metre rows. It's definitely not 3.5 metre rows. So those trees are on 3.5 metre row spacings, which are quite big. And there's some seriously dense, quite large trees on needing 110 to 120 litres per 100 metres, or more than 2,200 litres a hectare in theory. And chances are, given the way our industry works, they were probably being successfully sprayed at 2,000 litres a hectare for the most part, these big trees. And then they wonder every now and then why they have an unexplained disease problem or something. That's because they've come under pressure. Avocados are more extreme, and it's useful to, you may not be able to see the differences between these canopies so much, but when you get into a crop like avocados, the nonsensicalness of spray, if that's a word, just the idiocy, it's wrong to put the same hectare rate of chemical and volume onto trees which are so distinctly different in size. And we usually try and spray avocados to the point of runoff, or we used to. And the range of volumes needed on these trees is sort of 1,000 to 2,000 to goodness knows what. Those things are 17 meters tall. I love that photo. That's spraying with a single-sided large airblast, so that's probably a meter fan. It's got 3 Massotti guns in there. See how the fan's rotating counterclockwise. It's picking up the air from this side and projecting it up into the tree through the volute. And yes, we can push up to 17 meters out of a sprayer like that, but we've completely lost control of the spray plume, and it's actually starting to drift out of the tree because the wind is just gently coming from right to left in that photo. So that's another whole problem, but this is a tree volume discussion. And again, that's a 5 meter pole in here. 5 meters, that gives you a sense of the range of tree sizes. And because the trees are at their densest, this is evergreen trees, they're at their densest before they've really shaded themselves out. At about year 7, that they get so dense in here, and you can see this block shading underneath the tree, that the leaves inside can't be sustained and they fall out, and you end up with a tree that looks like this, which is actually easier to spray apart from the height than this dense thing. So this is a tree where we have to slow right down, try and encourage the growers to prune the trees to open them up. And then it becomes a bit easier again, but height becomes the problem. And I won't worry about it's the same div, so you can actually express how much volume you need on the basis of tree height and what coverage factor you need. And so this is all expressed on litres per 100 metres, which is really, really easy to convert back to litres per hectare. I tend to do all the calculations on a litre per 100 metre basis these days, and then if the industry wants to talk hectares, we talk hectares, or acres if we have to, but I hate to do that. And yeah, I won't worry too much about these other points here. This bit's important though. I think the biggest barriers to improving agrochemical rate decisions in Canada are the stupid way your labels are written. And then there is probably just as much variation and advice around those labels as we see in New Zealand and Australia, where spray reps tend to anchor themselves often inappropriately to conservative high hectare-based rates that may not be relevant on modern, more intensive thin wall canopies that our industry is tending to move towards. So it's worth thinking beyond what we're doing currently. In grapes, we've had this active program in our 40-odd thousand hectares of wine grapes, and it's taken 6 or 7 years to convert the industry from a totally hectare-based prescription to a row length-based prescription, and the chemical companies have come on board with it. So it's been a persistent effort for quite a long time to get there. I've got no idea what the time is. You're probably sick of me, eh?
It's 8:52.
Yeah. So should we just take questions? If there are any. How many people are left?
47.
Oh wow, you guys are stalwarts.
They're troopers.
There's so little feedback. I feel like I might be just talking to myself.
Nah, we're here.
And yeah, well, thank you for staying. And yeah, let's just ask questions.
Well, there was a question here about the V trellis, but I just kind of want to get Leslie to reiterate her question a little bit, and I can't find it. She said here, the multi-leader systems in a V trellis, are they into the row rather than down the row? And I think you were talking about sprayers at that point. So
She said that, okay, let me pull it up. Said the diagram was showing the top of the tree sticking into the alley, so it looked like the V canopy goes into the row rather than along the trellis.
So our Vs are always projected down the row.
So like a Tatura trellis, the
yeah,
same
yeah, very
idea.
much so. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That was it.
So it's not that common, but it's starting to become proven to work quite well. And the thing that's really exciting about it is that the structures that growers are using for some of these modern V trellises integrate hail netting with rain covers and cherries with tree support in apples. And what we're seeing in New Zealand is, I don't know if it's happening in Canada, but we're getting an increasing frequency of extreme weather events. We've had devastating hail just after Christmas in Nelson that took out half of the apples in the region, which is about a third of New Zealand's. Nelson produces about a third of the apple crop and most of our hops for beer, which is a tragedy. And half of that was decimated by hail. And our growers are going to be forced into hail netting. We're going to be forced into brown mum-ray and stink bug exclusion netting when it comes to New Zealand. And so the growers are looking for more intensive cropping systems that they can protect. And the big downside with the netting, obviously, is the light exclusion part and complications with bees. But that's the way we're heading. But I saw some amazing netting the other day on a V trellis block, which used half the steel that they would have had to use for tree supports and hail netting if they were put up as separate structures. It was just brilliant. And what the industry is way ahead of us in terms of the growers are finding cool ways to grow trees and then recognizing that sometimes the spraying practices haven't kept up with the new tree forms, which is why this research program that we're just about to start is so exciting, because it's actually addressing that in these new tree forms. And the kind of productivity that we're talking about, they're always looking for over 100 tonnes a hectare of apples on these new training systems. And the sort of sustainable yields getting up around 140 tonnes per hectare, which is staggering. When our industry 15 years ago was really happy if it could do 60.
We have a couple more questions, Erica.
Yes, so we have a broad question here. What can we expect the future of spray tech?
Oh, sorry, I was going to do a whole talk on that. Oh, damn. What am I going to do? I'll show you something. Sorry, it's going to just take me a second to find it. So if you can bear with me, this is amazing. And I'll try and not labor it too much.
Is there any work on autonomous sprayers?
Oh, very much so. That's what I'm looking for.
Solid set sprayers?
Our solid set's a complete joke. Absolute, complete, and utter farce. And it should never have been funded. I hope there's no one offending here. Yeah. That was very optimistic, but stupid. So I'm just going to have to do a quick search because I had it open and I've lost it. Yeah. And I'll zip really quickly through here because it's got some cool videos in it. I just need to share it. And the videos better work. They did when I tried it earlier on today. Share. Oh, sorry, I've opened the wrong. Sorry, going too fast. Bear with me for a second.
These these fact sheets that you're showing, are they available online for free?
Some of them are, yeah. Just, oh, damn it. Oh, this is worth seeing if you can bear with me. Sorry. Trouble here. Let's check this one with the videos in it. Oh, we'll just go for it. So I've just stepped up the toolbar and I'm trying to find the sharing button now. Until I'm not a good user here. I've completely lost the sharing part of this. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Stop share and then share again.
It sounds like there's a didgeridoo playing in your background.
I can hear that. That's a plane taking off, I think. We live near an airport. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. So really quickly, this is about LiDAR and spray deposits and variations and all the rest of it. So LiDAR is this amazing tool for measuring canopy geometry, and I started working on it when I worked in England for a year back in the 90s with a guy called Peter Walklate, who was a physics trained engineer who was taking kit like this and using it to scan canopies, which is pretty cool. And a LiDAR is just a rotating mirror which a laser shines into that measures the time of flight to go out and hit something and how long it takes to come back again at a known angle. And you can plot an XYZ coordinate of things that you've hit. It's not like a camera, it just measures spatially. And you can generate these pretty cool. This is what Peter was doing back in the 90s. So there's the trees he was scanning, and these are the LiDAR pictures of them. And it can be used to estimate canopy volume, but more importantly, you can factor in canopy density as well, which is something that's seriously missing from material volume calculations, which is why they're quite subjective. And so Peter was working with a guy called Jerry Cross, who's an entomologist, retired entomologist now out of East Malling, and together they came up with a dose adjustment system to break the hectare prescriptions prescribed for English apple growers by the European labelling system, which is the same system as effectively you've got. And using these LiDAR pictures, they wrote this key, which said, and they wrote it for different apple canopy training systems. But basically they said, if your canopy looks like this when you're standing side on, you need the full dose of chemical as prescribed on the label. But if it looks like this, you can get away with about half. And if it looks like this, you could possibly get away with a quarter. So that was the system that they used to successfully legally adjust label rates away from hectares to put less onto smaller canopies. And so we started playing with it around 2003, and I bought a LiDAR, this one here, which is a SICK LMS 200 back in 2009. That cost me $13,000, and the software for it, Peter's software, cost me $3,000 a year to use. And it's bigger than a bread box, and I've been told it's a boat anchor now. But these are the sorts of pictures that we were getting. So this is an unusual canopy for us. That's V trellis pear trees, but so our modern V trellises are much higher walls than those. This was an old couple that picked from the ground, and we played in grapes and apples and all sorts of things, lots of numbers, and it kind of had so much potential, but it didn't work. And now the hardware is cheaper and more reliable, and and we're just getting smarter with the use of this sort of equipment. And so this is, I think I used this talk at the end of my Apple talk last year, but and I want to show you where we've got to from here. So if this works, that's a robotic, fully autonomous tractor working in Australia. It's center articulated. It's from Swarm Farm Robotics. It goes quite slowly as it enters the row, and then as it knows where it is, it speeds up. And they're using it for mowing and spot spraying weeds, and they're trying to use it in a variable rate spraying project, towing a sprayer. Kind of cool, but what's going on there is a robotics engineering company is looking for solutions in the market. And so they've built the robot and then they're trying to find the use for it. And you can rent one of those for about $70,000 Australian a year on a 3-year contract. And at the end of, if you can get 70 grand's worth of work out of it, that's great. And at the end of 3 years, they'll upgrade all the hardware on it and they'll give you another one and another 3-year contract, and so it goes on. So this is the Gus sprayer out of California, and I was a bit rude about it at the time because it just looked like dumbass technology on a smart robot. To me, it's an old-fashioned airblast sprayer, not very sophisticated, spraying massive nut trees. And I took the sound off here because the it's a little bit optimistic in some of what was being said. And I think they've evolved, to their credit, I think they've evolved a lot beyond what they were promoting when I did this video clip, so I should really update it. So there is a degree of sensing going on. They will turn off nozzles if they're in the gaps and things. And the idea here is that sprayer can actually, you can have one operator running 5, 6 or 7 of those things from a desk somewhere. You can see the sprayer coming out into a gap here, turns off. See how quickly it turned on again? To me, the control systems on there weren't sophisticated at all. This is a completely different approach to the same problem where you have scanning technology, building maps, which are then used to make better decisions. And the scanning application here is counting. And so there's a whole raft of groups around the world working on these counting machines. So this thing here has a LiDAR and a LiDAR. So we've got 2 of them. They're 3-dimensional LiDARs. They produce between 10 and 100 times more data than that thing that I paid $13,000 for. I can't remember, 10 years ago. We've got 2 of them on this unit. This is an Australian rig, but it's working in New Zealand. So this is one that I'm involved with. And it's a 3-dimensional LiDAR. It actually sees around corners because, trust me, I'm a scientist. It can generate better views than the old 2-dimensional LiDARs. And down here, you've got a camera. It's just a standard RGB camera, and it's got 2 strobe lights which light the images that's taking. So it's taking a series of photographs through the orchard at about meter intervals. And here's the same thing on the other side. So it's got 2 cameras on it, 2 LiDARs, strobe lighting, and this is what it looks like when it's running. The typical driving speed in apple and grape blocks is around 15 to 20 kilometers an hour with a Polaris. And I've long tapered headlands here, but I'll leave the video running because you get a sense of the speed as he comes past. And we're counting flowers in apples here. So this was November last year, year before last. So it's doing about 15 kilometers an hour. And this is the kind of map that you get. And what I'll do in a second is take you to that map and how you can interact with it. So I haven't loaded it into the PowerPoint yet. So this is at the extreme end of the technology for sensing and sprayer adjustment. And so this is the USDA intelligence sprayer, Hepping Zoo's baby, I guess, which you can now buy as a commercial add-on. It's using pulse width modulated novel. So that's come to New Zealand. There's at least 2 of these working for the first time this season in New Zealand in grapes and apples. The cost, it adds between $40,000 and $70,000 to the cost of the sprayer. And you've got to question whether it's robust and has value. And it's a technology which is well established in agriculture being applied to horticulture in a really cool way. And I really expect to see a lot more of this. And we'll feel our way into it. But there is this kind of middle ground where you can generate maps that the sprayers can follow for far less cost than putting that sort of tech onto a sprayer. And it's a completely commercial space, and there will be all sorts of offerings in it, and some of them will be successful and some of them will be absolute lemons.
David, does that adjust the air volume as well?
No, but there are sprayers out of Europe that are starting to do that, but more likely to do it on a prescription basis rather than on a real-time sensing basis, except for the wind direction adjustments, which some of the European sprayers actually have a wind direction sensor, and they'll distribute a greater percentage of this air output to the upwind side of the sprayer, which is brilliant. But the trouble with all this stuff, and my fear about the USDA sprayer, is that they're using proprietary algorithms, as they describe it, to make the rate adjustments. That's their secret sauce, and so they're protecting that. But because they're not transparent, we don't really know what the sprayer is doing. And some of those proprietary algorithms in some conditions will be wrong. So we've got to be really, really careful not to absolutely trust new technology in a new market. But it's totally the thing to go for.
Apparently there are 2 of those sprayers here, the ones that you just showed.
Cool. And yeah, we're going to see more and more of them. I'll just show you, I'll just stop share and go to this other thing that I was kind of saving up, which is this. And share again.
You're getting better.
I'm getting better, but I'm still getting confused when I'm flustered. Okay, so that little Polaris mounted scanner with the 2 cameras and the LiDAR on it, what you're looking at there's, I don't know, how big's that block? 2.8 hectares in this blue block here. And this was scanned 28th of January last year. Yeah, I think this was last year. It must have been last year. So if I click on that, I've opened up what we call a heat map of a fairly intensive block. So 28th of January, these are fruit counts. So this is showing 179 fruit in that tree that you can see in the picture there, with 89 in the upper half of the tree and 90 in the lower, 179. I'll open up all of these. I think it's going fast enough to see them all. Hopefully the connection won't die here. So there's about, my guess is there's probably about 5 terabytes of data in this map.
Wow. When
it's scanned, there's a photograph from either side every meter of row. Okay, so what you can see there's the day that, this is outside the block. There's a picture from the camera looking outside the block. I'll move into the block. Here's different thumbnail shots of so let's go to one of these areas with almost nothing. They're replacement trees because they flooded that area of the block and they're not in production yet. So that was a wet patch. They hadn't drained properly and the trees died, and they've got problems here. So you see the little trees there. And where the dark colors are, you've got lots and lots of fruit. And I can put a satellite photo on there just so you get a kind of a context for where that orchard is. And I can, there are high resolution photos. When the grower gets the data, every 10th photo is saved as high resolution, so they can actually really get in there and have a look at what's going on in the trees in the block. But there's too much data to give high resolution for everything. Now this is where it starts to get really interesting. So that's a fruit count number, but this is the LiDAR data. So we'll look at the canopy density. It'll just take a minute to load that data in as a map. There we go. It follows a similar pattern to what you were seeing before with the fruit count data. So there's no, so that's, I'll go to a dense part. So what you're looking at there is, on the right-hand side, is rather than the picture, is the LiDAR point cloud, just a slice. And it's showing that the height of the tree there is 4.5 meters tall. The LiDAR, which is sitting at the point where the gray triangle meets, and the data that's presented, canopy height 4.46 meters, canopy area, so the cross-sectional area of that canopy is about 3.5 square meters, and the canopy density there is 4.47, which means that half of the LiDAR rays went right through that canopy without touching it, which makes it relatively open. And you can also see the adjacent tree on the other side, and then you're picking up some data from the trees in the rows right opposite, even though, because quite a lot of the LiDAR data is going right through. So the really cool thing about this is that in doing a paid service for fruit counting, for fruit crop load management, we're picking up data on the canopy, which we can then assign to write variable rate spray maps, which can be loaded into a precision ag controller, which are readily available in the market. And so you could actually get your orchard sprayer to follow a precision rate map as used in the arable industry. And the technology cost behind this is a fraction of putting that highly sophisticated variable rate phosphorus modulated thing onto a sprayer. So it's at the opposite end of the technology, but it's probably far more affordably applied. And I'm not going to make any predictions as to which is going to win out in the end. And I think there's room for both of them. But the point is that both of these technologies are available to the industries now. As I said, there's at least 10 groups around the world that we're aware of that's developing all that kind of fruit counting technology and all the things that go with that. And there's several groups around the world developing the variable rate technology with real-time sensing. And it's an amazing journey that's coming, and and robotics is an end point. You know, we do have the robotic producers who are looking for solutions and trying to find things to fit onto their robots. These are some of the solutions that can fit onto their robots. And the driverless car technology that's descending on us is going to find huge applications in agriculture. That's probably a really good point to stop if you're happy with it.
Yes.
Erica?
Any more questions?
Doesn't look like it. I had one question though. So I was on a call last week with some people that are doing similar analysis, and they said it could take up to 2 days to process the data. So I'm just wondering how long it would take for something like that. You said that the speed is pretty quick to go through the orchards, but I'm just wondering processing wise.
Yeah, there's been a processing wall which all of the different providers have hit and are overcoming. So Zespri, when they first started counting kiwi fruit, they developed the scanning technology and found that they could scan about 30, 40 hectares a day with the scanning technology, but then realized that it was going to take them 7 months to process the data they'd collected, which is a little bit after the crop was harvested. And what's happening now is the best of the providers are able to do hour for hour. So an hour in the field is an hour of data processing or less, and are able to return maps the following day. So, and what we're seeing with the USDA smart sprayer is they're actually recognizing the value in the data that the LiDAR is collecting, and the spray delivery map is a proof of placement map. And so they're actually generating some really interesting data from the sprayer passing through the orchard. So we're going to see more and more data collection mechanisms and more use of data, and the problem is going to be that we're going to drown in data, and we need to find smart ways of managing and using it. I'll just end the session, if I can, with just a plug for Airblast 101. It's you know, I can't emphasize enough what a good job Jason and Mark have done of this book. I was a minor contributor to it, and it's free. It's such a resource. So if you haven't seen it, go on to Sprayers 101 and you can download a free ebook copy of it. such a wealth of information. So,
Okay,
and yeah,
thank you.
I think you guys are amazing that you've still got extension, people like you, Wendy, and Erica, that you still have an extension service linked to research. We've lost it. So,
All right, thank you very much. We'll make sure that the powers that be hear your comment about keeping extension going. Thank you very much for your presentation, David, and thank you for everybody for tuning in. This will be posted on the OFVC website and will also indicate on the On Fruit blog when it's available. So thanks everybody, stay safe, and I'll see you tomorrow, David.
yeah, thank you. Good night all.